I wanted to convert the Street Bob to a chain drive since I got the bike, and I finally got around to it, so let's check it out. What's up, everybody? This is the first of a video series related to the chain kit conversion on the Softail Street Bob. In this video, I'm going to cover the unboxing and installation of the chain kit. In the second video, I'm going to give you a formal review of the chain kit. And in the third video, I'm going to give you an assessment of the differences in having a chain versus a belt. And there may be some additional videos that come after that, but I know for sure we're going to have 3 videos related to this chain kit conversion. And of course, be sure to subscribe and enable all notifications so you don't miss any of that content. Now, this is a pretty lengthy video because it's a rather involved project, and I've divided this video up into about 9 different sections. You can use the links down in the video description to jump ahead if you want to look for a certain section of the video. And FYI, towards the end of this video, I am going to cover gear ratios and give you some important considerations to think about as you look at the different sprocket tooth counts that are available on the chain kit. And there's a link to that section of the video in the video description as well. If you saw the teaser, you might have heard me say that I'm using a chain kit that you might not have heard of. And the chain kit that I went with is from Vulcan Engineering. I came across the Vulcan Engineering chain kits a few years ago. They caught my eye immediately, and I've been looking at them along the way ever since I first came across them. And so I was really excited to have an opportunity to actually work with this kit. And I do want to give a quick shout out to Nick over at Vulcan Engineering. I appreciate you. Thanks for your help. Let's get into the box and check this thing out. I went with a 25 tooth front sprocket. This thing looks really nice, and check out this extra machining. That's going to be very beneficial when we get to reassembly, so you'll see that once we get further along in the video. For the rear sprocket, I went with 55 teeth, and I went with black powder coat. I really like this powder coating so far. It looks great, and they do have a chrome option available as well. You also get a rear sprocket spacer that's made out of aluminum, and it's got very nice machining. You get grade 8 bolts and lock washers with a really nice zinc coating. And FYI, I'm not actually going to use these lock washers because I decided to go with a sprocket locker instead, and you'll hear more about that a little bit later on in the video. And of course, we've got the chain. You'll have a ton of options when you go to pick your chain, but I went with a black and gold X-ring chain. And of course, this thing is covered with grease. The grease on these chains is legendary, and I do have a great tip for dealing with all this grease on the chain. I'll cover that later on in the video. You'll also need a few more parts to go with the chain kit when you do this conversion. You're going to need a primary gasket kit, and it should come with O-rings for your drain plug, but just make sure that it does. And if your bike is like mine, you're going to need this thing called a tower gasket, which probably does not come in your kit, but is absolutely critical and required for the project. Don't try to use RTV instead of the tower gasket. Just get the tower gasket. It's only about 1 inch in diameter, and it costs like $3 at the Harley dealer, but trust me, it's worth it to just get that gasket. You'll also need a new compensator bolt. The manual says do not reuse the compensator bolt, so that's the approach I took. Plenty of people reuse these bolts, but it's such an important component, I think it's worth the $10 to get a new bolt. Depending on the age of your bike, you may also need new chain case bolts. Those bolts have rubber washers integrated into the back of the head to keep everything from leaking. My bike has relatively low miles, so I did not bother replacing those bolts, but again, the manual does recommend replacing those bolts. Of course, you're going to need primary oil to refill the primary. And one thing that is optional, but I highly recommend, is a sprocket lock of some sort. And on my project, I went with the Hughes hand-built sprocket lock. You'll need a few tools and such for this project, and a couple of them are somewhat specialized. You'll need bits for your primary housing bolts and derby cover bolts, a big T70 Torx bit for the compensator bolt, a 1/2 inch socket for the chain case housing bolts, a really big 2 1/4 inch socket for the primary drive, 36mm and 1.1/8" sockets for the rear axle, a 1 3/16 inch socket. You're going to need a pretty big set of snap ring pliers. I think mine are like 12-inch pliers, and I'll put a link to them down in the video description. It's a pretty beefy snap ring, so don't try to do it without snap ring pliers. It's dangerous. There's a lot of tension on that snap ring, and it's better just to have the right pliers to be able to get that thing off of there. A good torque wrench, and a breaker bar, probably at least a 24-inch breaker bar, a chain breaker and riveter like the RK UCT 2100, 262 red Loctite, 271 red Loctite, and 243 blue Loctite. There are also a few tools that are optional but highly recommended. A high torque impact gun, which already mentioned, and it's pretty much a necessity even though it's optional. A low profile oil pan like this one from Harley-Davidson, rubber gloves, a primary drive locking tool. There are several options available. I went with a block, but if I had it to do over again, I'd go with one of the steel bars because my block barely survived this project, and here's what it looks like now. A 7/16 14 thread restorer for the rear sprocket bolt holes. Now that's not a tap, it's just a thread restore, so it's much gentler on the threads, it just cleans them up without removing material. A torque angle gauge, or at least a protractor. I'll get more into that when we get into reassembly, and I've got a great tip for you where you can use a protractor and know that you're getting exactly the right torque angle on that primary drive nut without the use of a torque angle gauge. A chain alignment tool like the Motion Pro 080048, a chain tension measuring tool like the Motion Pro Slack Setter 080674, and a motorcycle jack or lift. Before we get into the meat of this project, let me cover a few important points and remind you of a couple of things. The first one is, I am not a professional. I'm just a tinkerer and a project guy learning as I go. This project will take some time, so be prepared for that. And it may make sense to break it up into a few different work sessions like I did. I worked on it across 2 different weekends just to make sure that I could take my time, do everything that needed to be done, and not feel rushed and stressed. There's a decent amount of disassembly and reassembly in this project, and you may run into some problems. But don't sweat it, take your time, be meticulous, and you can work through those challenges one by one. A couple of the torque specs on this project are really high. In fact, one of them is so high, you don't even get a torque spec. You have to do it based on a torque angle. Based on that, it may be beneficial to get a high torque impact driver to help with this project. I'll show you a way that you can use that in a way that honors the torque specs without just going crazy and over torquing things. And in my case, I was able to rent a high torque gun for like 25 bucks. It's definitely worth doing that if you have the opportunity to rent one or if you already have one. I recommend breaking all of the bolts loose by hand so you can feel if everything is moving freely or if it's binding up and potentially going to break off. Once you've broken them loose by hand, go ahead and use an impact driver to back those out the rest of the way if you want to. You may not be able to do that with the high torque fasteners, but if you can, I recommend it. Get yourself a manual. When you have a manual specific for your bike, you'll have all the torque specs, all the settings, and all the details so that you know you have everything exactly right. And lastly, be sure to check the torque specs for your bike. I'm going to be referencing the torque specs for my 2019 Softail Street Bob. They may or may not be the same for your bike, so be sure to check your specific torque specs for all these bolts. So let's cover some prep for the project. Go ahead and take the bike for a short ride to warm it up. That'll help when we drain out the primary oil. I have forward controls, so I didn't need to remove mine, but depending on how your bike is set up, you may need to remove some things on the left side to be able to get to the primary. Leave the bike on the jiffy stand. Go ahead and release all the clutch cable tension using that adjuster down near the frame. Go ahead and remove your chain guard too. Take your derby cover off, position your oil catcher, back out the drain plug, drain all the primary oil out, and while you've got that drain plug out, go ahead and inspect the magnet to make sure you don't have a lot of metallic debris on there, and go ahead and replace your O-ring as well. Once it's drained out all the way, you can go ahead and reinstall your drain plug, and then we'll get into the rest of the disassembly. Take your derby cover off, remove the primary chain case cover, and keep your bolts in order because there are 2 different lengths. Remove that big snap ring. Good snap ring pliers will save you a ton of frustration, and they're a lot safer. Remove the release plate and clutch push rod. Insert the locking block. Remove the main shaft nut. It's reverse threaded, and it's the only reverse threaded part on this whole project. Remove the compensator bolt. This is the first place you may want to use that impact gun once you break it loose. Add a zip tie to the chain tensioner to keep it compressed, and then remove it. Remove the primary drive chain assembly. Remove the compensator. And when you remove that, be sure to keep all of those parts in the same order that they were when you pulled them out. And one tip for that is just to put a zip tie around all those parts because they have to go in a specific order, and you do not want to get any of those pieces out of order. Go ahead and remove the 2 starter bolts from the back side of your primary. Loosen and remove the primary chain case housing bolts. These are all the same length, so you don't have to worry about keeping them in order. Once you get all those out, you can go ahead and remove the primary chain case housing. Now's a good time to position your motorcycle on a jack if you have one. Now it's time to remove that primary sprocket. Remove that locking plate. Now you can install the bushing on the end of the shaft and go ahead and install that big socket. Once again, the impact gun will be your friend. I'm not going to keep that belt, so I went ahead and cut it at this point. Clean the threads on the primary drive shaft. Remove the rear axle C-clip. Use the 1 1/8 inch and 36mm sockets to remove the rear axle nut. Remove the rear axle and make note of the order that the spacers are in on each side. Remove the rear wheel, remove the sprocket bolts, and remove the old sprocket. Clean the hub threads using that 7/16/14 thread cleaner or thread restore, and remember, it's not a tap, it's just a cleaner. It doesn't remove metal like a tap does. Chain kit. It's finally time to install the first new part. Install the sprocket spacer and line up the bolt holes. Set the sprocket on the spacer. If you pick a chain kit that does not come with sprocket bolts, do not reuse the old hardware. Those need to be replaced. If you're using a sprocket lock, you can discard the lock washers and go ahead and install the base plate for the sprocket lock. And this part is definitely fiddly. So what I did is start with all of the bolts torqued to the lowest torque setting, and then as needed, I gradually tightened the different bolts until everything lined up and I was able to put the lock ring in place. It's a bit fiddly and it took quite a few tries, but the goal is to have all the bolt heads line up with the sprocket lock ring without exceeding the torque range. Once everything is lined up, you can then put blue Loctite on those short bolts that hold the lock ring in place. And that's the only place you have to use Loctite when you're using a sprocket lock like this. And it's important to note that HHB recommends checking the rear sprocket bolt torque after about 100 miles. Lube the axle using a light film of anti-seize, and it's time to install the rear wheel. Let's back up just a little bit and talk about gear ratios, because you will need to pick one when you order your kit. And the gear ratio is how many revolutions of the front sprocket it takes to get one full revolution of the rear sprocket. And that gear ratio is determined by the number of teeth on the front and the rear sprocket. 24 tooth front, 51 tooth rear is listed as the stock ratio on the site, but that may differ from bike to bike. So 24/51 calculates out to 2.125. In my case, I had a 32 tooth front sprocket for the belt and a 66 tooth rear sprocket for the belt. So 32/66 calculates out to 2.06. That means the front sprocket with the belt had to rotate 2.06 times to generate one full rotation of the rear sprocket. When you pick your chain kit sprockets, you have the opportunity to go with similar gearing, steeper gearing, or taller gearing. Steeper gearing is numerically higher and it translates into more aggressive acceleration, but you lose some top speed. Taller gearing is numerically lower, and that translates into less aggressive acceleration, but added top speed. So I went with the middle of the road 25-55 combination. That gives me about a 2.2 to 1 ratio, which is just about 7% higher than my stock ratio. So I'm gonna lose a little bit of the top end, but I'm going to get there quicker. That also means that at any given speed, I'll probably be turning about 7% higher RPMs than I was with the stock gear ratio. Let's get back to the project. Install your wheel, insert your axle, make sure all your spacers are in the right place, loosen the adjusters all the way, go ahead and put the axle nut on the axle and just put it finger tight, push the wheel all the way forward. I chose to install my chain now. You can do that at a later point in the project if you want, but I'll give you all the instructions that I followed in installing the chain at this point. You could also clean the chain first. I decided to install my chain and then clean it after the fact. I'll cover that later on in the video. Install the new transmission sprocket, and at this point, do not put red Loctite on, just snug it hand tight for this part of the project. Route the chain around the sprockets, make sure the adjusters are backed out all the way and the wheel is all the way forward. Pull the chain tight and find the point to break the chain. Make sure it's where two narrow links meet. Break the chain using a chain tool. Grease the master link O-rings and install the master link. This is where the chain tool comes in. You really need a good chain tool for riveting the chain. You could get away without one for cutting the chain, but when you put the chain back together with the new master link, you really need a good tool to do the riveting. Mushroom the rivets using a chain tool, and I will do a separate video detailing this process later on. For final torque on the transmission sprocket nut, you're going to need either a torque angle gauge, or you can go low tech like I did and use a protractor, but it's just as accurate. I also plan to make a short video detailing this process, but here are the key points for now. Get a protractor, grab that big 2 1/4 inch socket, turn it upside down on your workbench. Line up your protractor so that the center pivot point of your protractor is right in the middle of that socket. And you're going to need to mark 4 points on that socket: 0 degrees, 35 degrees, 40 degrees, and 45 degrees. Make sure you transfer those to the outside edge of the socket, because you'll be looking at the outside of that socket when you torque everything down. Remove that transmission sprocket nut, apply the 271 red Loctite, go ahead and put the bushing on the end of that shaft, and then slide the socket over that main shaft nut. Initial torque is 100 foot-pounds, then you back it off 1 full turn, then you torque it to 35 foot-pounds. And this is the point at which we either need to use the marks that we've scribed onto our socket or use a torque angle gauge. Put a mark on your front sprocket that corresponds to the 0 degree mark on your socket. And then what you want to do is torque that primary nut until you get to the 35 to 40 degree range that you've marked on the edge of your socket. And again, this is where that high impact gun is going to be your friend. And because you have marked that socket, or you're using a torque angle gauge, you can use that impact gun and just torque it down until it gets to the range that you need. Just make sure you don't exceed that range. The range that you're aiming for in this is 35 to 40 degrees, not to exceed 45 degrees. And I recommend just going right to around 40 or 41 degrees. Once you get your torque set, then you can check to see if your locking plate lines up with the bolt holes. You may need to tighten it a little bit more to get that locking plate to align. And if you do tighten it more, just make sure you don't go past 45 degrees. And thanks to this great machining on this front sprocket, we do not have to grind away the ears on this locking plate. So great job on that, Vulcan Engineering. Put blue Loctite on those locking plate bolts. Go ahead and install the locking plate and torque those to 90 to 120 inch-pounds. Apply a thin film of oil to the rubber portions of the round crankcase gasket, and go ahead and install that by lining up those dowels. Go ahead and put blue Loctite on your starter bolts and spread a thin film of oil on the main shaft lip seal. Tighten the starter bolts to 22 to 24 foot-pounds. Go ahead and put blue Loctite on your primary chain case bolts. Install the primary chain case, torque the chain case bolts in sequence to 26 to 28 foot-pounds. Be very attentive when you reinstall that compensator. If you use a zip tie to hold everything together, that's a great starting point. And when you reassemble it, just know that it is possible for that rearmost compensator spring washer to drop down behind the shaft extension. If that happens, it won't line up correctly. You can reassemble it that way, you can ride it that way, but it will cause problems. So just make sure that all those washers spin freely as you're assembling the compensator, and make sure that everything stays lined up until you get some tension on that compensator bolt. And once you start to put a little bit of tension on that compensator bolt, and you know that all those compensator parts are actually aligned the right way, then you can go ahead and torque everything down. And as a final reality check, once you've torqued the compensator, you can look straight down on the top of the primary and make sure that that primary chain is perfectly in alignment with the edge of the primary. If you see that that primary chain is at an angle compared to the chain case housing, then you know something is misaligned and you're going to need to recheck that. Reinstall the primary chain, compensating sprocket, and clutch. Reinstall your chain tensioner. Make sure you put blue Loctite on those bolts and torque them to 21 to 24 foot-pounds. Once it's installed, you can remove that zip tie. Make sure that there are no pieces of plastic left in there. Apply 2 drops of 262 red Loctite. Tighten that main shaft nut to 70 to 80 foot-pounds, and remember, it is reverse threaded. Set the first torque on your compensator bolt to 100 foot-pounds, loosen it a half a turn, and then set your final torque to 175 foot-pounds. Reinstall the clutch push rod, reinstall the release plate and retaining ring using those big snap ring pliers. Install the new primary gasket. Make sure it lines up correctly with the dowel pins on the chain case housing. And remember that tower gasket for the shift linkage pass-through. Do not reuse the old one. Do not try to use RTV instead. Just spend the $3 and get a tower gasket. It's going to save you a lot of trouble. Trust me on this. Reinstall the primary chain case cover. Make sure to put the long bolts where they go towards the front of the primary. You can torque the chain case cover bolts to 144 to 156 inch-pounds in sequence. Make sure your drain plug is installed and and make sure you've put a new O-ring on that drain plug. Now's the time to add your primary oil, and for this you want to leave the bike upright, and you want to use what's called the dry fill amount. So you want to start with about 40 ounces of primary oil, and then you can begin to check where the level of that oil is, and it needs to come right to the bottom of the pressure plate in your primary. Reinstall your derby cover. You probably got a new seal with that with your gasket kit, and the bolts on the derby cover should be torqued to 25 to 35 inch-pounds. The hot tip for that crazy chain grease is to use WD-40. If you just spray a little bit of WD-40 on a rag, you can clean it off that way. You could also just spray the chain down with WD-40 and wipe everything down. I would not soak it in like a container with a large amount of it in there. I would just either spray it on and wipe it off, or spray it on a rag and wipe it off with a rag, but it will definitely cut that grease very well. And that really goes a long way, because those first few rides are going to be quite messy if you don't get all that grease off the chain. I actually cleaned every single link one by one. Outside plates, inside plates, rollers, yeah. This is where that optional chain alignment tool comes in really handy. I've done it with and without, and the chain alignment tool definitely makes it easier. You can attach that chain alignment tool to the rear sprocket, use the rear axle adjusters to get the chain centered on the sprocket. Sight down the chain from the rear to the front, and use the arm on the chain alignment tool to make sure it's parallel to the chain line. And if you don't have a chain alignment tool, you can sight down the chain from the rear sprocket to the front and make sure that it's pointing in a straight line between those sprockets. Once you're comfortable with that chain alignment, it's time to take a look at the chain tension. So how much chain slack should you have? I went with 1/2 inch of chain slack at the tightest spot on the sprocket, and I based that off of the 1978 to 1980 Harley-Davidson service manual. Some people prefer more like 1 inch or 1.5 inches, but I felt pretty good with 1/2 inch based on that manual. So if you have any other thoughts on that, drop those in the comments and let me know. So rotate that wheel until you see the least amount of chain tension, and once you find the tight spot, you can set your slack. If you need to decrease the amount of slack, you can tighten those chain adjusters to push the rear axle backwards. And once you get the slack set to the point you like it, recheck your chain alignment to make sure that nothing is shifted. Once you're satisfied with the chain alignment and chain slack, you can torque that axle nut to 95 to 105 foot-pounds. After you've tightened that axle nut, rotate the wheel a few more times and recheck your chain alignment and tension just to make sure that nothing's shifted. Let the red Loctite cure for 24 hours and go ride that thing. Chain kit. I really like the appearance of the chain. I just think it looks good. I think it fits with the bike, and I really like being able to see that chain and see that rear sprocket. And I even thought about taking the swing arm bag off, again, just so I can see it better, but I have no storage whatsoever on the Street Bob, and if I take the swing arm bag off, I won't even have a place to put my rain sock, so maybe keeping that. I like the look, I like the performance, I like the simplicity, I like so many different aspects of it, and it has been a really fun project to install this chain and learn about it and share that information with you along the way. Don't forget, coming up in the other videos in this series, I am going to give you a formal review of the Vulcan Engineering Chain Kit, and I'm also going to tell you what it's like having a chain kit compared to having a belt after I've logged a few hundred miles on. I do plan to leave the chain guard off so I can see that chain, but I put it back on just for the first few hundred miles, just so I could avoid that remaining grease being slung all over the place. After a short ride or two, be sure to check your chain tension and alignment to make sure everything's still where it needs to be. And don't forget, it's a good idea to recheck the torque on your rear sprocket bolts after about 100 miles or so. Have you converted your bike to a chain, and what chain kit did you use? Or are you interested in doing this project? And if so, what chain kits are you looking at? Drop in a comment and let me know. I love to hear from you and get your input on all the projects that I do. And I love to hear about the things that you learn as well. And if you have any other recommendations for videos to do in the future, drop those in the comments as well. And if you found this video informational or useful, please do hit that thumbs up button and share it with your friends. That really helps the channel out a lot. It means a lot to me, and it shows YouTube that this content matters to you. And if you're new here, please do consider subscribing, hitting that notification bell, and enabling all notifications so you'll be alerted when new videos come out. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the ride. I'll see you next time.